All right, so today we're really going deep, you
Hmm.
know, into the mind of Aristotle.
Oh, always a good time.
Always a good time. Specifically, we're going to be looking at his theories of knowledge.
Okay.
How this philosophical giant believed we as humans acquire knowledge
Yeah.
and how we make sense of the world around us.
Right.
And to do this, we're going to be looking at two of his works,
Okay.
primarily Nicomachean Ethics,
Yeah.
and then also his Coethics.
Interesting combination. So are we going to see how ethics and knowledge are intertwined in Aristotle's thinking?
Well, that is certainly one of the things that we're going to be exploring.
Okay.
It's not just some kind of abstract idea,
Right.
right? Like, how do we know what we know?
Yeah.
Well, Aristotle had some very specific ideas
Yeah.
about how this works, and we're going to get into that.
Sounds fascinating.
It is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And so to kind of set the stage here,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to be looking at, first and foremost, where does knowledge begin?
Yeah. That's the fundamental question, isn't it?
It is the fundamental question.
Ah.
And according to Aristotle, he believed that knowledge begins with our senses.
Of course. Makes sense.
Right.
We experience the world through our senses.
Absolutely.
Sight, sound, touch, taste, smell.
It's kind of like we're just born with some kind of encyclopedia
Right. Exactly.
downloaded into our brains.
No preloaded knowledge.
Right. We learn by experiencing life as it unfolds around us.
So would you say that he kind of, I don't know, anticipated maybe modern empiricism in a way?
I think that there's definitely, some parallels there.
Yeah.
So he calls this starting point sensation,
Mm.
but he says that sensing isn't enough.
Oh, right. We need more than just a fleeting sensory experience. We need to actually understand what we're sensing.
So give us an example of what you mean by that.
Well, imagine a baby seeing a dog for the first time.
Okay.
It might not really register that it's any different than, say, a fluffy cat
Right.
or a stuffed animal. It takes repeated exposure, seeing different types of dogs, hearing them bark, maybe even getting a slobbery kiss.
Yes. To really form the concept of dog, it's through that repetition, that repeated experience, that we start to make those connections in our minds.
And that's interesting because, so he's basically saying that, you have sensation, but then you need experience on top of that
Exactly. Experience is like the bridge between sensation and true understanding.
to really solidify it.
Yeah, you could say that.
So we've got sensation, we've got experience, but I'm guessing Aristotle wasn't content just leaving us there, right? Like there's got to be more to it.
Oh, absolutely. He wouldn't want us just wandering around soaking up sensory data like sponges. There's a higher level of knowing that he was really interested in.
Right. So where does reason fit into all of this? Because, I'm thinking that's probably the next step, right?
You're right on track. Aristotle believed that reason was the key to unlocking a deeper level of knowledge. It's what elevates us beyond just recognizing a dog to truly understanding the concept of dogness, how it fits into the bigger picture of animals, living things, and so on. Okay, so reason's like the key, but how do we actually use this key? How do we go from, just seeing a bunch of dogs to understanding this, abstract concept?
It's like our brains are little pattern-seeking machines constantly looking for order in the chaos. And that's where reason comes in, helping us connect the dots, so to speak.
So you're saying reason is like the thing that helps us categorize, organize all this information, these experiences.
Precisely. It helps us move from the concrete to the abstract, from those specific observations to universal truths.
Okay, but how do we make that leap? Is it some kind of magical mental process?
He called it induction, and while it might not be magic, it's pretty amazing what our minds can do. Essentially, we observe patterns, we make connections, and we draw conclusions based on those observations. And for Aristotle, this wasn't just some neat party trick. He believed this process was fundamental to science, philosophy, to all the ways we seek to understand the world.
So it sounds like this idea of reason was pretty central to Aristotle's thinking.
Absolutely. And what's even more fascinating is how he linked this capacity for reason to his concept of eudaimonia.
Hold on, eudaimonia. Isn't that usually translated as happiness? What does happiness have to do with reasoning?
Ah, that's where things get really interesting. You see, for Aristotle, eudaimonia wasn't just about fleeting pleasure. It was about living a fulfilling life in accordance with our true nature. And that nature, he argued, is fundamentally rational.
Okay, so you're saying that for Aristotle, using our minds, actually engaging in deep thought, that's all part of living a good life, not just, indulging in whatever feels good in the moment.
Exactly. He believed that true happiness comes from using our rational faculties to their fullest potential. to understand the world, to contemplate the big questions, to make choices guided by reason rather than just impulse.
That's quite a challenge to our modern-day obsession with, instant gratification.
It is. It makes you wonder what Aristotle would think of our constant distractions, our addiction to social media. But that's a conversation for another time.
Agreed. But there's one more piece of the puzzle I want to bring in. We mentioned that we're using Aristotle's Poetics as one of our guideposts for this deep dive. What does poetry have to do with all of this talk about knowledge and reason?
Ah, yes, the Poetics. This is where things get really interesting. Aristotle believed that poetry, and tragedy in particular, could also be a source of knowledge. He saw it as a form of imitation, a way of representing human actions and emotions that could teach us about ourselves and the world.
So you're saying it's not just about pretty language and rhyming words. There's actual knowledge to be gained from engaging with poetry.
Absolutely. Think about a really powerful play you've seen. The emotions it evokes: empathy, fear, pity. Aristotle believed that these emotions could actually be incredibly insightful. They can help us understand human nature, the consequences of different choices. Ultimately, they can help us figure out how to live better lives.
So we've got sensation, experience, reason, happiness, and now poetry, all mixed up in Aristotle's view of knowledge. It's like he's saying we need to use every part of ourselves, our senses, our emotions, our minds, to really grasp what it means to be human and to understand the world around us.
That's a great way to put it.
But how does it all actually work? What are the specifics, the nuts and bolts of this system?
That's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of Aristotle's reasoning process, the mechanisms he outlined for how our minds process information and arrive at true understanding.
All right, well, I'm ready to dive deeper. But before we do, I just want to remind our listeners that we've really only scratched the surface here.
Oh, there's so much more to explore.
There's so much more to explore, so stay tuned, because next time we're going to be uncovering the inner workings of the Aristotelian mind.
It's going to be a wild ride. Okay, so last time we were talking about how, for Aristotle, the journey toward knowledge, it all starts with those sensations and those experiences, but to really get to that true understanding, you got to have the power of reason.
Yeah, it's amazing, though, to think about just how our minds are working.
Right.
Constantly, we're just bombarded with all this sensory information, and our minds are,
Sorting through it.
yeah, trying to categorize everything, making sense of it all, and
Yeah.
it's, quite a process.
It really is. And
Yeah.
luckily, Aristotle gives us this framework for thinking about how complex that process really is.
Okay.
And one of the key ideas that he brought into this is this concept of nous.
Nous. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah. It's a cool word.
It is a cool word.
It's often translated as intellect or intuition.
Okay.
But think about it as kind of like the part of our minds that is able to grasp those like fundamental truths,
Right.
those really basic principles that everything else is built on.
Like the building blocks of knowledge.
Exactly. And Aristotle actually believed that these principles, these first principles as he called them, they're not something that we learn through experience.
Really?
Yeah. He actually thought these were innate to the human intellect.
So are you saying like we're born with this like almost like pre-programmed knowledge?
You could say that. It's like we come into the world with a certain understanding of how things work at a very basic level.
Okay, that's wild. So what kind of truths are we talking about here? Like, give me an example.
Well, one of the classic examples is the principle of non-contradiction.
Okay.
The idea that something can't be both true and false at the same time and in the same way.
Right, that makes sense.
It seems pretty obvious, right?
Yeah.
But this is the basis, the foundation for all logical thinking.
Yeah, without it, we wouldn't be able to reason at all, I guess.
Exactly. It's like the bedrock upon which we build all our other knowledge.
Okay, so we have nous, which is giving us these like foundational truths.
Right.
But then how do we take those truths and apply them?
Yeah, how do we use them to make sense of all those specific things we encounter?
Right, exactly.
And this is where this other idea of episteme comes in.
Episteme.
Episteme. It's often translated as like scientific knowledge or demonstrative knowledge.
Okay.
And Aristotle described it as a process where we use deductive reasoning.
Oh, deductive reasoning, like Sherlock Holmes.
Exactly.
Okay.
You got it.
Okay.
It's that classic Sherlock Holmes style where you take a general principle, you apply it to a specific case, and then boom, you can reach a logical conclusion.
Okay, yeah. So like, give me an example of how that works.
Okay, so let's say our general principle is all humans are mortal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty basic. And then we have this specific case, Socrates is human.
Right.
Okay, so using deductive reasoning, we can then confidently conclude, therefore, Socrates is mortal.
Okay, yeah, so it's like a logical chain reaction almost.
Exactly. It's like those, those proofs you do in geometry class where each step leads to the next.
I see. But wait, didn't Aristotle also talk about the opposite of deductive reasoning?
Yes. Good memory.
Like going from specific observations to the general?
Exactly. You're thinking of what he called epigoge, which is often translated as induction.
Hypnagoge. Okay, so remind me how that one works again.
Well, think about that dog example again. You see a bunch of furry creatures, they bark, they chase squirrels, they wag their tails, and through epigoge, you take all those observations and you kind of put them all together.
And then you're like, dog.
Exactly, nailed it. You've arrived at the general concept based on those specific instances.
Okay, so it seems like episteme is about using knowledge we already have,
Right.
whereas epigoge is about, like, building new knowledge,
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it.
like from scratch.
And Aristotle recognized the importance of both of these processes, both deduction and induction.
Okay.
They both play a critical role in how we acquire knowledge. But here's the really interesting part.
Okay, what's that?
Aristotle didn't think knowledge was just about, cold, hard facts
Right.
and like rigid logic. He also recognized the importance of something he called phronesis.
Phronesis. Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for us.
Okay, so phronesis is often translated as practical wisdom
Practical wisdom.
or prudence.
Okay.
And this is about going beyond just knowing facts and theories and actually knowing how to act in the world, how to make good choices.
So it's like having a map versus actually knowing how to navigate a city.
Perfect analogy. You can have all the theoretical knowledge in the world, but phronesis is what helps you apply it in real-life situations.
So it's like the wisdom to know which path to take, how to deal with unexpected obstacles.
Exactly. And here's where things get even more interesting. Aristotle actually believed that emotions play a vital role in phronesis.
Wait a minute, emotions? I thought Aristotle was all about logic and reason. How do emotions fit into all of this?
It might seem counterintuitive, but Aristotle recognized that emotions, when they're properly cultivated, they can actually help us make good judgments. They can give us insight into what's really important, what we value, and even motivate us to act in accordance with those values.
So it's like our emotions can actually guide us toward what's right.
In a way, yes. But of course, for Aristotle, it was all about balance. Our emotions need to be guided by reason, and our reason needs to be informed by our emotions.
It's all starting to come together now. We've got gnosis providing those fundamental truths. We've got episteme and epigoge helping us reason and build knowledge. And then we have phronesis guiding us in how to actually use that knowledge wisely. It's a pretty comprehensive system.
It really is. But remember, we also talked about how poetry plays a role in all of this. And that might seem a little strange at first.
It does seem a bit out of place. I mean, we've been talking about logic, reason, wisdom, and now suddenly we're bringing poetry into the mix.
Well, for Aristotle, it wasn't out of place at all. He saw poetry, especially tragedy, as this powerful tool for exploring the depths of human experience, our emotions, our aspirations, our search for meaning. And he believed that these explorations could actually contribute to knowledge and understanding.
Okay, but how exactly does that work? I mean, how can poetry, which is often seen as being about feelings and imagination, how can that lead to actual knowledge?
Remember how Aristotle saw tragedy as a form of imitation?
Yeah, like an imitation of human actions.
Exactly. He argued that by witnessing these imitations on stage, we could experience a powerful emotional response, what he called a catharsis.
Catharsis, like a purging of emotion.
Exactly, a purging of those difficult emotions like fear and pity. And he believed that by going through this catharsis, we could actually become more receptive to learning about virtue, about understanding the consequences of different choices.
Wow, so it's like poetry can actually train our emotions, make us more virtuous.
That was his idea. He saw poetry as offering us these profound insights into human nature and the human condition, helping us to become more self-aware and ultimately lead better lives.
This is incredible. We've gone from sensation and reason all the way to practical wisdom and the power of poetry to shape our character. It's amazing how much depth and nuance there is to Aristotle's view of knowledge.
It really is. And I think what's even more remarkable is how relevant these ideas still are today. We live in a world that's vastly different from Aristotle's time.
Oh, absolutely.
But those fundamental questions he grappled with, how do we know what we know? What does it mean to live a good life? How can we use our knowledge to make the world a better place? Those questions are still as relevant as ever.
More relevant than ever, I think. But that does raise the question, how do we apply all this ancient wisdom to our modern world?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. Get ready for a mind-blowing exploration of how Aristotle's timeless ideas might actually help us navigate the complexities of our digital age.
Well, we've been on quite the journey through Aristotle's theory of knowledge. From those basic sensations to the power of reason.
Right, and then that whole idea of practical wisdom, phronesis.
Yeah. And even how poetry can, shape our understanding.
It's really a pretty amazing framework.
It is. But the question I keep coming back to is, how do we actually apply all this ancient wisdom today in our modern world?
Right, because Aristotle's world was so different from ours.
I mean, can you imagine Aristotle, transported to our time, surrounded by smartphones and the internet?
Oh, talk about a culture shock. But, even with all the technological advancements, I think he'd still see some familiar ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, because his basic principles like observation, categorization, using reason, that's all still at the heart of how we approach knowledge today.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, science, for example. It's
he's-
this advanced form of what Aristotle was talking about.
Right, it's all about observation, analysis, trying to understand the world around us.
But what about the sheer volume of information we have today? I mean, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, that's where I think he might have some concerns.
Yeah.
Imagine him scrolling through a social media feed.
I can't even picture it.
Right. All these opinions, news stories, often without much evidence or reasoning behind them.
Yeah, it's like we're drowning in information.
But are we really gaining knowledge?
Right, exactly. That's the question.
And then there's the whole thing with algorithms,
Oh, yeah.
shaping what we see online.
Yeah, and potentially creating those echo chambers
Exactly.
where we're only exposed to things we already agree with.
And that would definitely go against Aristotle's emphasis on, seeking truth through dialogue and debate.
Yeah, for sure.
He believed that knowledge shouldn't be based on opinion or popularity, but on evidence and solid reasoning.
So how do we navigate this crazy information landscape that we're in?
Well, I think Aristotle would say that we need to develop those intellectual virtues that he valued so highly. Things like discernment, critical thinking, intellectual humility, and being open to different viewpoints.
So basically, becoming modern-day Aristotelian philosophers.
Exactly. We need to be careful about what we consume, what we believe, and how we think.
But how do we actually do that? In a practical sense.
Well, for one, we can start by being more mindful of our information sources.
Sure.
Where are we getting our news from? Are those sources reliable? Are we actively seeking out different perspectives?
Yeah, because it's so easy to fall into that trap of just reading or listening to stuff we already agree with.
Right.
And then, there's the whole attention issue.
Oh, yeah.
It's so hard to focus.
We're constantly bombarded with distractions.
Yeah. How can we even think deeply about anything when we're constantly interrupted?
I think Aristotle would say we need to reclaim our attention. Really make an effort to carve out time for reading, for reflection, for those deep conversations that challenge us to think in new ways.
Like creating those mental spaces where we can escape from all the noise.
That actually engage with ideas.
And remember, for Aristotle, knowledge wasn't just some abstract pursuit.
Right.
It was all about living a virtuous and fulfilling life.
So it's not just about knowing stuff. It's about using that knowledge to make better choices.
Exactly.
To become better people.
Right.
And to create a better world.
And in that sense, his message is still incredibly relevant today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's a call to reclaim our attention, to think critically, to be open to new ideas, and to remember that knowledge is a journey, not just a destination.
And it's a journey that can lead us to a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
And on that note, I want to thank you all for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the mind of Aristotle. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have.
Yeah, it's been a blast.
And I hope it inspires you to continue exploring these ideas, to keep asking those big questions and to keep seeking knowledge.
Because like Aristotle said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And with that, we'll leave you to ponder the wisdom of this ancient philosopher in our modern world. Thanks for listening.